the subject matter for today, a deeper dive into the EAP, considerations for implementation. So yesterday, Christoph and Brody set the stage for today's session. Many people or many states are maybe, if not totally new to the idea of the EAP. Certainly, they're new to how to approach this from a system standpoint, from implementation, for considerations within your office, that type of thing. And so that's what Brody is going to speak on today. Many of you were on yesterday's call, but I do want to reintroduce Christoph and Brody. Personally, I've known Christoph for many, many years. He's been a great advisor and friend to NPA and NASA over the years. He is now the 4th Secretary General of the Hague Conference on Private International Law. He assumed that position on July 1, 2013. He joined the Permanent Bureau way back in 1997 as Secretary. He's responsible for the administration of the HCCH and the operation of the Permanent Bureau. He designed as Principal Administrator of the Electronic Apostasy Program, the EAP. He was a member of the Model Notary Act Revision Committee, and which produced the Model Notary Act in 2010. Mr. Brody Warren is attaché to the Secretary General. He's also the Senior Legal Officer at the Permanent Bureau at the Hague, and he joined the Permanent Bureau in 2014. He was working as part of the International Legal Cooperation and Civil Procedures Team, and was appointed to the position of attaché in 2020. He's continued to work on the day-to-day operation of the 1961 Apostasy Convention under the supervision of the Secretary General. All of that to say, as Christoph likes to say, they're the Hague guys, right? When we're having issues with maybe a contracting state accepting one of our documents or something like that, and they've been so helpful over the years. I know here, and I'm sure to most many of you. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brody and Christoph. And as Rachel said, as we go through this, if you have a question, please use the chat feature to raise your hand, and then she can interject on your behalf as we go through. Gentlemen?
Thank you very much for that introduction, Mac. And I guess good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast, and good morning to the rest of you, I suppose. It's, again, a pleasure to be with you for the second part of the presentation. I suppose many of you who were on the call yesterday would have heard a lot of the introductory and more, I guess, higher level explanations from our Secretary General, who's sitting at an appropriate distance away from me. They're in The Hague here. So I'm going to take you through essentially a little bit more detail of what we heard yesterday about the Electronic Apostasy Program and its implementation in the context of the Apostasy Convention. As we said, sort of a deeper dive here. Just to begin with, I will show you, just as a recap of what exactly we're talking about when we talk about the Electronic Apostasy Program, is the idea that when you have a public document that, for example, has been executed in one of your states or in any of the other contracting parties to the convention, so other countries around the world, there's a public document that's been executed. In this case, it may have already been executed in electronic format in terms of maybe an e-notarization on a document, or a diploma, a birth certificate, marriage certificate, those kind of things. In some cases, depending on the internal law, it may also be a simple traditional paper public document that's been executed. In the context of the Electronic Apostasy Program, we're talking about the paper documents which are then scanned, to which an electronic apostasy can be applied. So in order to present that public document abroad, the convention establishes a mechanism where there's a standardized apostasy certificate that is then affixed by the competent authority. We use the term competent authority because that comes from the language of the convention, but that's something that in your cases is mostly the Office of the Secretary of State for many of your documents. I know in the US for federal documents there are other authorities, and for various documents coming from the courts there are other authorities which can issue apostees for those specific types. But for our purposes today, it's mainly the documents that you receive at the Secretary of State office that need to be affixed with an apostille. Once that document has that apostille, it's ready to then be presented abroad, and that's the simple kind of standard one-step process that is conducted in all other contracting parties to the Convention as well. There's an apostille that's on a public document that then can be produced and have its effect when presented abroad. The additional element the apostille convention adds is the verification of that apostille. So any recipient can check the number and date of issue, for example, to verify that the apostille they have in their hands, or in this case, that they've electronically received, is indeed the one that was issued by the competent authority. So that's that verification mechanism. So those two aspects there, the issuance and the verification, are the two things that we're talking about in the context of the electronic apostille program. The first being the e-apostille or electronic apostille, and the second being the e-register or electronic register, both of which are established by the Convention but are very compatible and in fact continue to operate more effectively than ever in an electronic context as well. So just to confuse you a little bit, I'm going to take the second one first, the e-register. First of all, I've just got a little example here to show you. Here is a sample apostille from the Republic of Korea. They have a nice QR code which can be scanned on a smartphone, as you can see in the picture here, and they can actually, the user who has received the apostille, whether in paper or electronic form, can scan that QR code to confirm that the one that they've got in their hand or they've received electronically is indeed the same one that was issued by the competent authority of Korea in this case. So that's the little picture you can see on the right there, that they've got a visual check of the apostille that they've actually received. So the e-register is essentially a sort of database, and that's kind of the easy part of the easy component to implement. Most of your offices would keep registers as required by the Convention anyway for all the apostilles that are issued, but traditionally this is done in paper form, so now it's just more of a case of having a database that can be accessed. I will show you another couple of examples of those as we a little bit later on. But as we heard yesterday, many of the states who have already embarked on the road towards full EAPP implementation in the US already have electronic registers. Just to recap a little bit here, the legal requirements that apply that are established by the Convention, which is applied both to paper, traditional paper registers, but also to electronic registers. So the four requirements there are that in the e-register, recipients must be able to verify the number of the apostille, the date that apostille was issued, the name and capacity of the person who signed the underlying document that the apostille is authenticating, as well as the issuing authority of the apostille. So those are the key requirements. Some contracting parties have more information available in their register. For example, we just saw Korea, you can have a full visual check of everything on the apostille, but these are the four elements that are required by the Convention as a bare minimum. To show you a little bit what we're talking about in the context of the second component, this is the one that's a little bit more tricky, but actually we always think it's more complicated than it really is, and nowadays it's becoming easier and easier to implement, and this is the one that we wanted to focus a lot of our time on today. This is a sample of an electronic apostille. I've included the Adobe PDF logo because more commonly what we're seeing across the contracting parties and competent authorities that have implemented electronic apostilles, the most common format is PDF form, partly because of its interoperability and that recipients. It's very easy to send and receive and open, whether or not you have Adobe or not. Here on the left, you can see the model apostille. It's of course not filled in because this is a sample, and theoretically you would have the on the right there, the underlying public document to which the apostille relates. Now this is, I guess, depending, as we said before, depending on the status of electronic public documents in your jurisdiction and the legislative requirements in your state, the underlying public document may come in electronic form, in which case the apostille would be combined into, and then they would be secured in the same file, or that would be something that you would receive the paper underlying public document that is then, for example, scanned by an official at the Secretary of State office, who then issues the apostille and again combines that with the scan of the underlying public document that they've verified, and then that together is certified with a digital signature. In this example, you can see just at the top here, this signature panel saying that essentially it's, again, we've just made up an address there, but essentially that is the certification at the top that tells you that the certificate is valid, and that's how it would work in a standard Adobe practice. So as you can see, while the e-apostille sounds somewhat daunting, it's actually quite a simple thing. It's just one file that combines both the underlying public document and the apostille, and is together secured with a digital signature. As with electronic registers, the electronic apostilles also have to fulfill the basic requirements of the convention. And I'll just run through those here. We've got the fact that the apostille relates to public documents and that the convention applies only to public documents. That is determined by your own, the law of your own state. That's public documents that were executed in the territory of a contracting state is the term used, but basically that if it was executed on your territory and it's a public document, then it falls within the scope of the convention, therefore is eligible for apostillization, as we say. Your role as a competent authority when assessing whether or not to issue an apostille is to authenticate the origin of the public document to which it relates. So in this instance, what we're talking about there is that signature of the person signing the underlying public document, the capacity that that person had when they signed it, for example, a notary, whether they had that appropriate capacity at the time of signing, and of course the seal or stamp, if applicable, of the authority or of, for example, that notary that they've affixed their seal or stamp on the underlying public document. If you as the competent authority are satisfied with that origin is authentic, then you can issue an apostille. The other requirements of the convention is that the apostille must be attached to the underlying public document and that the model with the 10 standard items is used. We see various different forms of the model, but in general, you'll see from both the model we've seen and a couple of examples that I'll show you a little bit later, that the model has a frame. Generally, it has the word apostille at the top, the convention name in French, and a few other standard items, but in general, it's easily identifiable and easily recognizable in that sense. The interesting thing about these requirements is that while it may seem that there's a whole list of requirements, and these operated quite effectively for many, many years under the convention in paper form, and these requirements can be met and fulfilled even more securely and more efficiently in electronic form, and that's something that we're seeing more and more as the EAPP grows. So if you as a competent authority are satisfied with those things, then you can issue an apostille, or in this case an electronic apostille. Just to take it a little bit further, we currently have some competent authorities that are looking at the possible use of distributed ledger technology and blockchain technology. I don't want to frighten you or to take this too far, but just to know that there is a wide range of different options. In this case, it's actually a very similar concept to what we had with the PDF form, that you have the apostille as well as the underlying public document that would then be combined in one single file, as it were, but in this case, it would be more of a coded package that's then recorded on something like a distributed ledger technology or on a blockchain. So the concept is the same, that it's comprised in one file package, but we're seeing a whole range from the basic PDF right through to states which are ready to go with a pilot and using DLT. But not necessarily to show you that, but it's more to say that leads me to the next point there, that it's really up to you as states to determine what is the most appropriate technology for you. There is no one solution or one way to do this. It's something that we've seen different examples, and I'll show you some real life examples in just a moment. But essentially what we're seeing is that, as I've mentioned there, these principles of functional equivalence, and we did touch on this a little bit yesterday, but the idea that a signature, whether it's a wet signature or an electronic signature, should be equally valid. And in many jurisdictions, I know that is already the case in terms of reform to legislation and the way things are moving, in particular in light of the pandemic. But it's these principles that allow this flexibility, that anything ranging from a simple kind of solution where you take an off-the-shelf commercial product for your digital signature, you use Adobe PDF and combine the files, and then there it is, you've implemented your electronic apostilles, right through to developing your own certificate. For example, some countries have their own security and their own authentication or digital certificate that they use for their own apostilles. So we do see a wide spectrum of different things, but it's essentially up to you as the competent authority which one you select. And I think on that, the important thing is that we now know that even within the US, there are enough states that are interested and moving towards this kind of thing. So it would be, it's quite useful to share best practices in that respect. And as you sort of have the flexibility to develop any solution that works best for you, so it's good to share those experiences and then build upon the knowledge that each state has in order to find the best and most appropriate solution. A couple of other points here about the flexibility, I suppose, of the e-apostille program is one of the other elements is that the valid e-apostilles must be accepted when presented abroad. It's up to you as the issuing competent authority to determine what that means and how you've issued it. And if it has been validly issued and that you're satisfied with the origin of the document, as we explained before, that it can't be rejected abroad just because they don't have adequate regulation or legislation recognizing electronic public documents. That's something that has been reiterated. I think we mentioned it also yesterday, that it's just reiterated by our groups of what we call the Special Commission, countries and states coming together to discuss this. It's been re-emphasized over and over again. So that's something that we're quite strongly in favor of, I suppose, and quite willing to assist if this issue comes up. But that's a fundamental principle that underpins the acceptance of electronic apostilles abroad. Related to that is just to keep in mind that sometimes, though, the receiving authority may have specific requirements for the underlying public document. They can't reject the apostille. However, they may ask that the underlying public document is presented in a specific form, sometimes in hard copy. That, unfortunately, is still the reality because we have different states are at different levels of digitization. But that's why, I suppose, the adoption of the electronic apostille program is it's quite important that the adoption of it is accompanied by a kind of shift in thinking and also education of the recipients that, coming back to this idea of functional equivalence again, that just because a document was issued in electronic form doesn't make it any less valid than a different document that was issued in paper form. And I think that's something that we are seeing changing, but it's just perhaps not changing fast enough. But that's where I think it's very important that it's accompanied by this kind of education of recipients as well. And the final thing that I've put here is that essentially, ultimately, it is about the user. We encourage competent authorities and states to make use of technology not only to implement the e-apostille program and to start issuing electronic apostilles, but also, for example, to allow online application processes or facilitate the interaction that the user has with the website of your office or how those things work. So that's an important element as well. the other thing to keep in mind when considering that it's about the user and it's about the service that you're providing is that we're trying to resolve issues of any potential issues, whether that be a rejection or just questions, as expeditiously as possible. And I've put there that's where we can also assist. Of course, we heard the offer from Bill Fritzland from the Department of State yesterday that at the consular level, if you need assistance in terms of dealing with other states, that's also a possibility. But we also are willing to help engage and to assist in providing additional information that may ultimately ensure the acceptance of not only the electronic apostille, because as we said, that has to be accepted in whatever form, but also of the underlying public document, especially when in electronic form. So it's an important element of that the more we have that dialogue and that communication about the processes, the more likely it is that countries will be willing to accept these documents in electronic form on a day-to-day basis. As was mentioned yesterday, we do know of several countries, in fact, that are already issuing only electronic apostilles, often with electronic notarizations as the underlying public document, for example, or other electronic public documents. So that's something that we're seeing is a bit more of a shift. But in the meantime, we're very happy to assist in resolving any issues in that respect as well. But because it is ultimately about the user and facilitating the process, I think we'd like to maybe see a little bit of how it actually works in practice. So I'm going to just put, I'm going to go to the website here, and hopefully this continues to work. Checking you can still see the website. Yes, okay. So this is just the HCCH homepage. As Christoph mentioned yesterday, we are an organization. Apostilles are not the only thing that we do. But on the front page of the organization, the HCCH website, if you scroll down here, we have apostille. On the apostille section, scrolling down to the electronic apostille program part, we have what's called, you can see a list of operational e-registers. And that's where I'm going to go in a minute to verify some apostilles that I've got here as well. So we have at the moment, as was mentioned yesterday, 41 different countries that have various forms of electronic registers to verify the apostilles, of which we have the states of the US here. I've already opened a couple of them, but I'd like to first actually show you a couple of the apostilles that I've got saved. Actually, sorry, just a second. So the first example here that I've got is actually from Belgium. Is that working okay? So again, you can sort of recognize the frame and the 10 standard items. They've got a digital signature here from the Foreign Affairs Belgium. It still looks like, I guess, an apostille. There's a QR code for verification, and at the top here, you can see that it was certified by the, well, that's the the Belgian Foreign Affairs, apologies, using a commercial option. Actually, this is a certificate by Global Sign. If I go to the signature panel, we can see that it has been validated, and that's the signature. Yeah, that this signature has been, well, essentially about the digital signature. So that's quite a simple one with the underlying document as well, attached in the same file. But again, it's because that digital signature is a kind of off-the-shelf solution, and that works perfectly well. Similarly, this one we've got from New Zealand. Again, you can recognize the frame with the 10 standard items. Here they've got the digital signature here. You click on it, it says the same thing as what it was up the top here. We've got that it was valid, signed by the authentication unit of the Department of Internal Affairs in New Zealand, and the signer's evidence is valid. So that's essentially for the apostille. And you can see that it's actually, yeah, quite simple, that it's just the digital signature is what enables the electronic apostille. And here we've got, in both cases, they've used simple commercial off-the-shelf solutions from Global Sign here. I'd like to also just show an example from the recent Montana electronic apostille. You can see that this is an apostille but it has also been signed using DocuSign, as Laurie mentioned yesterday, and we can see that it's actually both, there's the code at the top here for DocuSign envelope ID with the underlying public document, and down at the bottom here you can actually see that there's a visualization of Laurie's signature as well, along with the seal on the side, but essentially that all signatures are signed and valid, and that continues to be valid, as you can see there with the little green tick as well. The important thing to know is that one other element is that as long as the electronic signature or digital signature is valid at the time of issuing the apostille, that's the important thing. We do understand that current limitations in technology mean that sometimes in many years into the future, it may, the signature itself may expire, but as apostilles never expire, the idea is that as long as it was valid at the time of issuance. But in most cases, nowadays, digital certificates last for quite some time, so it shouldn't be a problem, at least for the foreseeable future. What I would like to do, I've just got this one, and this one is not actually an e-apostille, but it's a sample from the state of California. I'm going to now verify both the Montana one and the Californian apostille in the e-registers for you. I could just go back to our webpage. You can actually access, for example, the Montana apostille verification. And if I check, we've got here the number 00592, and we can then submit. And you can see that it has essentially just enough details that are required by the convention. And that it is indeed, it's got a little green thing that it is indeed the apostille, the electronic apostille that we have in front of us. So that one is good. If I go then to the Californian electronic register, I can also see just by way of example that, for example, the electronic register is used for both paper and electronic apostilles. So here we enter the apostille number, the identifier number 8 there is 841, as prepared earlier. And then we've got on the 25th of July in 2017. And if we search it here, it comes back and says indeed that here's the details of the apostille as well as the online public document. So essentially, again, we can verify that it is indeed the same apostille that that we have in front of us. So I think at this point, I think that was about all I guess I wanted to show you today, and I thought perhaps we could use the rest of the time to maybe talk through any particular questions that you might have, both either for myself or for Christoph. But I think ultimately, as you can see, we've had a variety of different electronic apostille solutions presented throughout the years, and that number is only increasing. But essentially, the main element here is that, as was mentioned yesterday, the key thing about the electronic apostille program is its flexibility, and that it really is. There are some guiding principles, of course, and some legal requirements, but other than that, it really is up to you as the competent authorities to decide which system works best for you, and then adopt that as your EAPP solution. So on that note, I might pass it back to Mike and see if we have any particular questions. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Brody. Rachel, do you have any inquiries there from a chat box sample?
We haven't had any with the chat box, but David Hellman, I am going to unmute you. There is a question that he has. So David, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. I was just wondering, for the attachment of the public document for the e-apostille, if the public document is difficult to scan, like a diploma or a blueprint or something like that, how that might be handled, and if there are any instances where it'd be allowed or recommended to have some of the information redacted, such as a wet signature, personally identifying information, a notary seal, things like that.
I think I might take the second part of the question first. I think in the instances of redaction for the purposes of the e-register, that's certainly something that we do see in terms of depending on, as I mentioned before, the Korean example has a visual check of just the apostille. Some states do actually have, you can access it in the e-register with the apostille and the underlying document. I think it really does depend on what the internal privacy legislation says in your jurisdiction. With respect to redacting the actual document in the file, I don't think that would be, it would sort of be against the notion of it, in the sense that the security of the file is important, but also ultimately if it should be the same as if you're carrying the document around, really. That the recipient, if they are the holder of the original public document, they should be able to also be the holder of the apostille, and then determine with whom and which authorities they share that document. So I think in terms of the electronic apostille itself, we probably wouldn't redact it, but I think certainly for the e-register, to ensure that there was no kind of untoward behavior in terms of obtaining that online, I think that redaction would certainly be reasonable. As I understand, and perhaps Laurie can help me out here if I get this wrong, as I understand the Montana system, they don't actually keep any record of the underlying public document. It's just more, once they've verified, they issue the apostille, and then it's for the recipient then to decide with whom they share that information as well, particularly as a PDF file. The other question, in terms of items that are difficult to scan, that's actually quite a good question. I think it's something that we've encountered more and more, because diplomas, I think, are often being issued in electronic form. I'm just trying to think how you would get ordinarily. I'm not sure if. Yeah. I think in general, in those, some of those specific cases, I think, I mean, even a large diploma theoretically would be okay to scan, but if it's something that, for example, your office can't do or isn't comfortable doing, or there are various different pages and things, and it's also a question of resources there too. I think many states have actually opted for an option where, particularly until all diplomas are issued in electronic form, which again, we may be a very long way off in some countries, I would say that many competent authorities still would issue a paper apostille in that particular instance. But the idea is, as much as possible, if you can scan it, then it would be preferable, because then that makes it easier to take around. But I do understand that in certain circumstances, we do know that states still offer both, and often sometimes that is something that they will even ask the recipient to say, by default, we'll issue electronic ones, but if you would prefer, because of, for example, that your diploma is this big and has all these issues, and you'd rather that, some applicants can actually ask for or specify that they have a preferred preference for a paper apostille in that case as well. But we do know of other countries where, for example, Belgium and Estonia, I think too, where they are only issuing electronic apostilles, but that's because kind of the preliminary step of having an electronic diploma is already there. Whereas in these cases, because we're sort of still playing catch up with some of those legislative and regulatory provisions, it's probably wise to then just offer both options while you're in the transitional phase, I think. Is that sort of, yeah, hopefully that was all right.
Okay, Brady, there was another question. I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Reiniger. You are now unmuted to ask your question regarding securing recognition of e-apostilles in receiving countries.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. Warren. The question here is that you all have been gracious at The Hague to offer assistance with those of us who are sending e-apostilles to countries and the questions that arise. From the perspective of, in my case, I'm actually an attorney for multinational corporation, global corporation. There'll be other global corporations. What is the proper protocol? Now, some of these companies, they know. I've worked closely with Dr. Berlusconi, and I think their temptation is to say, Tim, just call Dr. Berlusconi to help. But I want to be sensitive to the protocols here. I mean, I would think normally it's the U.S. State Department that's contacting you all directly, or a particular government representative from a country. And so what would you advise? Because it's good for me to know as well, and others in my position who participate in calls, to be sensitive to this in terms of following the right protocols.
Okay. I think the first thing, thank you for that, Tim. I think the first thing is often, as soon as you sort of hear about a potential issue, many of those issues actually can, well, in our experience, can often be dealt with by simply contacting the authority that's receiving the apostille, the authority, the destinatory authority, because that. And for example, showing them extracts from the apostille handbook, for example, or conclusions that are from the documentation that has been prepared in this area over the years and is available freely on our website. And often that's actually enough. Sometimes the receiving authority may also have, may not necessarily be rejecting it, but may have questions about the way that it was issued or how to accept it, or they're trying to grapple with those kind of things. So it may even just be useful for them to understand, to be in contact with someone at the issuing authority. So for example, the Secretary of State office then contacts that. If the two authorities are in touch and they can understand each other's requirements and what the actual issue is, that's also quite helpful. Then I guess, then we kind of get to a point where it may be necessary to involve kind of in the US, the federal level, the Department of State. You may need consular assistance in the sense of, or contacting a diplomatic mission, an embassy or consul, either in the US or even abroad. Because sometimes there are also issues of language here as well, that depending on which country, you may not be able to actually communicate, so it's helpful to have that. And I think also, I mean, we are happy to assist, but of course, in the millions of apostilles that are issued around the world each year, we cannot feasibly intervene in all of these kind of cases. Ideally, if it's a communication directly between the authorities involved, that's the kind of first port of call. Again, I'm not sure if Bill Fritton's on the call as well, but if my understanding is then that if that doesn't work, then you can ask the Department of State in the US to assist as well. And then perhaps if there is a kind of more systemic problem or something like that, that's also where we would often get involved. And of course, that's why we do have very good contacts with most of the national authorities in many of the contracting parties as well. So people like Bill at the Department of State get in touch with us to be able to discuss the kind of more systemic problems, I guess, if they exist. But in general, I think most things, a large majority of those issues can be resolved on a case-by-case basis directly with the authorities involved, the issuing and receiving authority.
If I may just jump in at this stage to first of all just say that I totally agree with what Brody just said. So the protocol is basically in 3 stages. Use basic documentation that's available, contact your federal government, because it is actually the US that is a contracting party to the treaty. And if nothing has helped, we are certainly always available to try and put our word in and make sure that the apostille is actually accepted. The only additional thing I would say is that if it is a really time-sensitive matter, and there have been cases, in particular in the adoption area, where things have been very time-sensitive, you can also directly come to us if you prefer that. That's certainly an option as well. And by the way, that is true both for paper apostees or electronic apostees. We also have had problems with the acceptance of very traditional paper apostees, and we managed to intervene and make sure that the apostille was eventually recognized and used in the receiving country. So the basic response is don't hesitate to reach out. We are always happy to help and assist.
Okay, we have another question. Lee Basha has a question, and Lee, if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, my apologies. I'm going to unmute you right now to ask your question.
Yes, hello. Greetings, thanks everyone. So I spoke with the Secretary of State in one of the U.S. states in this effort by ACTEC to try to have it implemented in more states than Montana. And one of the responses that that Secretary of State said is that it's an expensive proposition for them to implement the electronic apostille and the electronic register, and given COVID-19, their budgets are stretched and they really don't have the capability to add more to their budget. Since you just sort of addressed all the technical aspects, but I didn't hear anything regarding cost, do you know anything related to that? And then I have another follow-up question afterwards, if that's possible.
I must admit I don't know exactly off the top of my head what the current costs are of a digital certificate, and I'm wondering if perhaps if Laurie is on the call, that she could perhaps comment, if at all possible, on what exactly it costs for them, because I think they had essentially an off-the-shelf solution for Global Sign. But ordinarily, it wouldn't be, in my experience, inhibitively expensive, because it's sort of we're talking literally about a license for essentially the software at one office usually, and the rest of it is kind of fairly freely available. But I see Laurie there is unmuted, so maybe you could perhaps comment on that a little bit better than I can, Laurie.
I can comment first on the cost of the actual e-apostille part of it. We ended up using DocuSign for the ones we've done, and through the state contracting system that we have to operate under, we're figuring our cost right now is going to be about $6.50 for each envelope that we do, so each apostille, which, you know, that's an additional cost to us. We're looking at, you know, possibly being able to, you know, charge that as an additional fee. Right now our fee for an apostille is $10, which really doesn't cover our staff cost, our personnel costs, and, you know, the system. So it's a little bit more expensive from that standpoint, but from a customer standpoint, you know, generally they're having to FedEx documents to us, and then we FedEx them back to them or on to the other place. So, you know, from a customer standpoint, it's a huge cost savings right off the top, even if we do have to implement an additional fee on our side. As far as the registry, that was part of our online filing system. So there is a cost to that. And I can't speak to how much it is. We were in the process of upgrading our notary database and notary filing system anyway, and that was available, and we of course took it. So, you know, it was just part of that cost. I can't speak any more to that.
Yeah.
Sorry, this is Christoph speaking again, and thank you first of all, Lee, for the very practical, important question, and Laurie for these very helpful, practical elements. I am simply going to repeat what I said yesterday, and preface that with, again, the comment that I say this with the greatest possible respect for all these officers, but I personally do not accept the statement that says this is too expensive. It just isn't. We have seen implementation of the EAPP in many different jurisdictions, and as Brody rightly recalled, there are different models out there. I literally remember how New Zealand implemented it years ago simply by buying the full version of Adobe Professional. They also bought their license from Global Sign, which is, I don't know, another couple of $100 a year. And eventually they decided to buy an additional server to run the e-register on a completely separate server, with nothing else on it but the e-register. So there was no possible link to any other government document. Okay, and a server, cost a couple of few thousand dollars, I would have thought, and they have become more expensive, maybe less expensive nowadays. Of course, at the other end, you have the model that was implemented in Spain, for example, which was a very comprehensive, very sophisticated, very well thought through system that took into account the federal structure, if I may say so, of Spain, to ensure all sorts of different things that nobody at the beginning thought were actually possible given the federal structure of Spain. But eventually they did, and they did so having financial support from the European Union. So the implementation in Spain was certainly significantly more expensive than the one in New Zealand. But the point is, it is possible to have a perfectly operational EAPP system in place with both components, the e-apostille component and the e-register component, for a few $1,000s. Again, to me, this is all service that you can offer to the client, customer. You will have happy customers that are, in most of the cases, perfectly happy to pay $15, $20 for their apostille, in particular if they know that they can submit their request online, sitting at home or at the office, and sending off the request to the relevant competent authority, and knowing that they will be issued an e-apostille that they can easily send abroad for use. So this extra service will come with huge customer satisfaction at costs for the office that are really absolutely perfectly reasonable, and which can indeed be built back to the user by adjusting the fee slightly. I'm turning to Brody because I can't remember by heart if we have new statistical information available, but back then we knew that the average fee for an apostille that's being charged around the world is about $20 US. And so, you see in the case of Montana, as Laurie said, there is wiggle room to adjust that, and I am absolutely convinced that the user would be happy to pay the $6.50 more because in turn they would get professional service back that allows them actually to operate. And in the day and age in which we live, to say that an online service is not possible or is too expensive, again, with all due respect, I do simply not accept that reasoning. Thank you.
Christoph, this is Mike Smith. I just want to interject here too. I just want to remind everyone that these presentations yesterday and today, where originally had we met in person, these are a kickoff to what hopefully will be acceptance down the road. And certainly all of us that work within state government are sensitive to the budget, the budgetary problems, deficits maybe that some states are experiencing because of the pandemic. I know here in Georgia, the budget for 2021 was adopted at 10% less than last year, and some of you are facing probably worse than that and things like that. So having said that, let's keep in mind, let's keep in perspective. For instance, I was thinking, we first started talking about electronic notarization 20 years ago, at least 20. And we still have states that are still coming around to that. I hope that we're not still 20 years from now, not that I'll probably be on those discussions, talking about acceptance or things like that of the e-apostille. But I bring that up to think of, to just kind of give you perspective about how these things have progressed in the notary world. Now, there's no doubt that the advent of remote notarization, electronic processes, that really was forced on some states because of the pandemic, that maybe for whatever reason, politically, budgetary, we're not going down the road of offering or authorized electronic a process for their notaries. To me, this is in the same realm. And I think that hopefully, we can look to better days from many perspectives, and as we move forward, our budgets will, look a lot better in the next couple of years as we move further into the future. So I just wanted to point those things out.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Lee, you had a follow-up question. I'm unmuting you again. Please feel free.
Thank you. Yes. The other comment from the same Secretary of State was, what good is it having an electronic apostille capability if they need to review the original document, because he claimed that the Secretary, that to do any issuance of an apostille, they need to see the original document. So doing things electronically aren't going to advance the situation. Any comment about that?
I think it's a sort of, in both cases, it's a bit of a chicken or the egg thing, that if, I understand the point there, but at the same time, if you don't have the electronic apostille capability, when eventually the time comes when you're presented with an electronic notarization, which is an electronic file, and then you're scrambling to do a paper apostille for an electronic file, it kind of seems counterintuitive. Then you'd be limited in that sense. And particularly, I think in light of the pandemic, we've been seeing a lot of changes in legislation and proposed changes of flexibility in terms of courts willing to accept testimony or statutory declarations, or we've seen different countries that have softened their notarization laws to allow, remote online notarization, for example, or e-notarization. And as the public documents, and electronic diplomas is another thing that we're seeing, that industry is also booming. So as the underlying public documents are increasingly being issued as originals in electronic form, the kind of most logical, the only way to deal with that would be through electronic apostille. So I can understand that perhaps it seems strange in a paper context, but as the underlying public documents change, so too will the apostilles need to change. So it seems that it might be an easier transition if you sort of start now, rather than having that situation of having an electronic document later that needs an apostille but only being able to issue it in paper. So that, I think, is the main element there that I would say. I'm not sure if Christoph, you have anything in particular to add?
Yeah, maybe just a quick follow-up. First of all, I would have thought that the added value, again, is customer service and satisfaction. If the person knows that the whole process of producing the apostille in the receiving country is going to be faster because it can be sent in electronic form, then that certainly is an added value, and in and for itself enough a reason, in my humble view, to go ahead with it. The only both practical and legal question that one needs to keep in mind in a situation where a person walks into an office with a paper public document and requests an e-apostille is to ensure that if the competent authority proceeds with scanning this paper public document, that the scanned version of the paper public document still is a public document in accordance with the local law, the law of the state where the public document was first produced in electron or executed in paper form. That is a specific aspect that we know had to be checked in a number of jurisdictions that went ahead with the implementation of the e-apostille component, and at least in one jurisdiction, Spain, that comes to my mind, they actually had to change their domestic local law to ensure that the scanned version of a paper public document originally executed in paper form still is a valid public document under the law of Spain. And that may be something that you may have to run with your Attorney General's office or relevant authorities to make sure that if you proceed with such a system, that the result would still be valid under your own local law. But as Brody rightly said, we see a clear tendency that public documents are more and more executed in electronic form to start with. And as I think I said yesterday, there is nothing more frustrating than to have to print an electronic public document for the sole sake of being able to issue a paper apostille, because that's the only thing that an office is capable of doing. And so by having to print the original electronic document, you lose all the advantages of the production of the public document in electronic form in the first place. So again, there are plenty of reasons, in my view, why offices should go ahead with the implementation, not the least of which is customer satisfaction and modern, effective service being offered by the relevant authorities. Thank you.
Okay, we have a few more questions. So the next question, it's actually a two-part question. So it says, is it safe to assume that once a state implements e-apostille, then all documents presented for an apostille are scanned as an e-apostille issued unless it is a document that cannot be scanned? So that's the first question. And then the second question is it acceptable to use both formats equally, or is the expectation to use e-apostilles generally and paper apostilles as exceptions?
Okay, thank you. I think in response to the first question, I think there is somewhat of an expectation that issuing electronic apostilles, then yes, you'd, in most cases, if presented with a paper document, that the expectation would be to scan it. But again, I would say again that that's up to the decision of the competent authority, in this case, the Secretary of State office, because we do know of many countries that, and I guess this responds to the second part of the question too, that many countries still do have both options, the electronic apostille and paper apostille. And again, to come back to the principle of sort of the functional, the equivalence aspect as well, the functional equivalence, that a paper apostille is equally valid as an electronic apostille. So for the purposes of the convention and for purposes of the kind of use of apostils around the world, it doesn't matter whether it's in paper form or electronic form. However, as we've seen, noting all of the trends and particularly in relation to electronic public documents, and if a state's going to go to the trouble of implementing kind of the electronic apostille program fully, then why not benefit of it because of all the benefits for both in terms of security, in terms of facilitating the circulation, as well as making the customer's life a little bit easier, or the user's life easier in that sense too. So I think it would be wise to sort of opt for a if not a full electronic apostille in all instances, but if that's not possible because of certain types of documents, as we discussed before, then perhaps have the paper as a backup. As I mentioned earlier, we do know of countries where it's kind of in the hands of the user or the applicant. When they apply, they say they would like an electronic one or a paper one. But I think that, again, is possibly an attitude that was maybe okay 5 years ago, but kind of moving forward, electronic apostilles should really become the default, I think. So I think in answer to both of the questions, it really is up to the competent authority. But I think from our perspective, we would very much encourage a focus on the electronic apostille with, for example, a scanned underlying public document or an original electronic public document as the default position, and then only use paper ones as a sort of very last resort. And I think, yeah,
just to follow up, and I wholeheartely agree and support everything that Brody just said. But just to come back to something I said yesterday, while the receiving state cannot reject the electronic apostille on the sole ground that it has been issued in electronic form, the receiving state may perfectly legitimately refuse the underlying public document in electronic form. So that is still a possibility, and if only for this reason, I think it's important from a practical point of view that all the issuing authorities maintain a capacity to issue apostilles also in paper form, just to ensure that if the customer faces a situation where the underlying public document, for whatever reason, must be submitted in paper form, that the competent authority can issue the relevant apostille in paper form too, so that the two travel together like that. We hope that these cases will diminish as time passes, but for the time being, we know of enough such circumstances that we do recommend to maintain capacity to issue paper apostilles as well, but certainly move towards a default system of e-apostilles. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. It is there a 118th member of the Hague Convention? And if so, who is it?
118th, was it?
That is correct, 118th.
Well, yes, because we have 118 contracting parties at the moment. The most recent one was actually Palau, which I think Christoph mentioned yesterday. Just for those of you who don't know, it's just kind of off the coast of the Philippines, an island nation, or group of islands, in fact. And the convention just entered into force, I think, in April or May, I think. I can't remember exactly when, but quite recently. So that was the 118th. In terms of perhaps, I'm not sure if the question was geared at 119th, but as Christoph alluded to somewhat yesterday, we have a number of countries that are interested, including, I guess, relevant players for the US, like Canada's looking at it quite intensely, China to apply it to mainland China. But I think if we had to put money on it, we're probably thinking that, not that we would, of course, but Indonesia might be the 119th, I think, at this point in time, is my understanding. But that's... That was the 23rd. 23rd, I apologize, that Palau entered into force, so, but recently in any case.
Okay. And there's also another question regarding the e-epices in the U.S. Besides Montana, what other states in the United States are producing e-epices?
I think, again, sorry, I must admit I skipped ahead a little bit on the proviso, or not the proviso, on the basis that I thought I didn't want to repeat things that Christoph covered yesterday, but I do understand that there are people on the call who weren't here yesterday. So I'm wondering if I could pull up the slide I thought, but in any case, at the time of the launch of the electronic apostille program back in 2006, there were a few early adopters, as we talked about already, Spain, New Zealand in a few years after that, but actually the state of Kansas issued a few electronic apostilles in 2007, but we do understand that I think that was not necessarily carried through to all apostilles, and as I understand, I think they've gone back almost to a little bit of a paper, mostly paper-based system, but we do know that there are quite a few states, in the U.S. that are interested, but Montana is currently the only one I think that currently issues electronic apostilles, and then we have a further 7 or 8 states that have electronic registers, being Washington, California, Colorado, West Virginia, Rhode Island, and I think I've forgotten someone, and I've forgotten...
Texas. Isn't it Texas?
Yes, I think it was. But yes, in any case, but so we can see that the interest is growing, but Montana is, I think, to our understanding, while Kansas has issued a couple of electronic apostilles in the past, Montana is the only one, I think, that's currently doing it.
And Nevada does registries, electronic registries, notaries too.
I was visualizing the maps trying to go across, and I definitely missed a couple, but thank you.
And does anybody else have any questions? That's all that I'm seeing in the chat. I just want to make sure I'm not missing anybody's raised hands or chat questions.
Rachel, I just want to add one, go back to, this is Mike, go back to the question about paper versus once you adopt or implement the electronic apostille process, what would take precedence, paper? Yep. From personal experience, and Rachel knows this, we've been required to develop certain electronic processes here in Georgia for different types of documents, and we always will defer to electronic. So I not having gone through this process yet, I'm just projecting that when we were to adopt the e-apostille process, everything that could be processed electronically, we would do so, and paper would be our backup. I don't know why else you would try to divvy that up any other way. Just personal projection there. Anybody have anything else? Okay.